We are called to double listening. Listening to both the Word and the world. We listen to the Word with humble reverence, anxious to understand it, and resolved to believe and obey what we have come to understand. We listen to the world with critical alertness, anxious to understand it too, and resolved not necessarily to believe and obey it, but to sympathize with it and to seek grace to discover how the gospel relates to it.
Oh, hi there. Let me wish you a very warm welcome to this unusual session of the 2020 FEUER conference. Who would have thought in 2019 that I'd be sitting here making a video for you to listen to instead of being able to fellowship with you? But here we are, and we are determined to make the best of this. So I am Christopher Watkin. I'm a lecturer in Melbourne, Australia, and I've also written a number of books on theology and philosophy and culture. And I have the huge privilege of thinking with you over these two sessions about a theme that has always been on my heart, I guess, close to my research and also to my thinking through ideas as a Christian. And it boils down to John Stott's idea of double listening, listening to the Word and to the world. It's simple enough, isn't it, for a child to understand? And yet it's an idea that is complex enough that the greatest minds and the greatest activists in the history of the Christian church have barely begun to scratch the surface about what this double listening can mean for Christians living in the world. And so I want to think with you about how this idea brings together many different biblical principles. Take every thought captive, for example, understand the times, work for the peace and prosperity of the city where you're scattered in exile, and also don't love the things of the world. Make disciples of all nations. There's something of all of these in this idea of double listening. And each of these Bible verses has two parts to it, doesn't it? There's a part that talks about God's word, make disciples, for example, and a part that talks about God's world of all nations. And in these two sessions, what I really want to try and get down to with you is to explore how we can do this double listening in our world today. And these sessions are really built on two principles, two theses, if you like. The first principle is that the Bible thinks. This might sound odd. In fact, it's intended to sound odd. We tend to approach the Bible, do we not, as something that we think about, something that we make sense of. But what I want to commend to you in these sessions is that the Bible actually makes its own sense. It interprets us. It interprets our world. Sometimes it does this very straightforwardly in verses like, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, or everything is vanity, a chasing after the wind. But it also interprets ourselves and our world through showing us certain patterns or rhythms of reality. Patterns of God's action in the world, patterns of understanding the world and people in it, patterns of relating to the concerns of this or that culture, or even rhythms of events over time and how things characteristically play out. I'm going to call these recurring patterns or rhythms by the shorthand of figures, and we're going to encounter a number of biblical figures in these two sessions. Well, it's my hope and prayer that understanding these principles is going to equip us as Christians to live wisely in this present age, to help us to understand and to evaluate the deep guiding assumptions of the culture around us, and also to help us commend the truth and the goodness and the beauty of the Christian message to all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds. The second principle is that as well as explaining the Bible to the culture, we need to explain the culture through the Bible. Apologists are quick, aren't they, and rightly so, to explain the Bible to our culture. But sometimes we're slower to see the need to explain the culture through the Bible. In other words, the Bible knows our culture better than our culture knows itself. And we need to seek that biblical perspective in all its complexity and richness if we're going to engage with our culture with the full range of biblical insight. I have to warn you that today's session is going to go quite fast. We're going to try and do creation and fall in one 45-minute slot. If you're interested to chase up these ideas more, have a look at the website thinkingthroughthebible, all one word, .com, where I tease out some more of the implications of these big biblical turning points. And you may be relieved to know that in the second session, we're going to slow down a little bit and just do redemption in one 45-minute session. Now, during this conference, I'm told there are going to be small group sessions. You're going to have the opportunity to engage with other conference delegates about some of these themes. So can I just encourage you as you go through, if you've got a question, you want to think more about something that I say, if you want to take issue with something that I say, please do jot it down. And there'll be lots of time in groups during the conference to be able to work through some of these issues that I'm raising. I wonder if you agree with me that there's a sad irony in many Christian attempts to engage in public discourse today. And that irony is that many of those doctrines and biblical passages that would be most able to help Christians to bring new thinking to the table in public discourse, well, those are the very passages and the very doctrines that Christians tend to shy away from or to be embarrassed by. Take the Trinity, for example. Ask a Christian to explain the Trinity, and what usually greets you is a stumbling and fumbling, grasping at metaphors. Or take the first 2 chapters of Genesis, and the way in which these have been framed in our culture to be all about Darwin and dinosaurs and the length of days. Christians tend to pull away from these ideas in public. But that is a huge disaster, because these are the very ideas and the very passages, I think, that are most able to shed new light and bring fresh thinking on ideas of broad public concern. Now, we've only time today to look at the Trinity, but can I direct you again, if you're interested to think more about creation, to look on the website thinkingthroughthebible.com, where hopefully you'll be able to find resources to help you. Too often, our contemporary culture dismisses the Trinity as irrational or as an alien imposition on the Bible, dating from 3 centuries or more after the biblical documents were written and owing more to church politics than to biblical witness. And obedient, sadly, to this cultural trend, many Christians seek to consign the Trinity to the too hard box of doctrine, or to the too contentious box of public debate. And many in the contemporary church have lost confidence in these foundational truths. And this is a disaster for Christian cultural engagement, because the nature of the God who creates is the foundation of the whole biblical edifice. If this isn't there, then nothing else quite lines up correctly. Everything looks odd, and everything will eventually fall down. So what I would love us to see in this session is that far from being an embarrassment or an impediment to sophisticated debate and to fresh thinking, the Trinity actually provides thinking Christians with a springboard to intervene constructively in some of the most important philosophical and social and political debates of our time. Let's begin with the very first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In this compact powder keg of a sentence, we already have two of the major distinctives of a Christian understanding of the world to do with the ultimate reality of the universe in which we live. And let's take them one by one. There have been many candidates in the history of philosophy for this most basic archetypal substance, the fundamental element of the universe that is basic and that can't be reduced to anything more basic than itself. The pre-Socratic philosophers Thales, Anaximander and Anaximenes are famous for suggesting, respectively, that everything is fundamentally made out of water, or an unlimited substance, apeiron in Greek, or air. The question that we're concerned with is, well, what about the Bible? When we dig right down to it, when we get down to the most fundamental substance in our universe that can't be broken down into anything else, that's preceded by nothing, when we get down to the very bedrock principle of the universe, what is it that our spade strikes against, biblically speaking? And the answer is personality. God is personal, and there's nothing before God, nor is there anything more basic or fundamental than God, no constituent parts into which he can be broken down. His personality can't be broken down into more simple building blocks such as atoms or forces or ideas. So therefore, on a biblical view, personality goes all the way down in our universe and all the way back. Before anything existed, there was the personal God. In the landscape of worldviews today, this commitment to fundamental personality is just odd. It's weird, and it's certainly distinctive. And the truth of God's irreducible personality is also a dynamite with the potential to revolutionize the way that the Christian thinks about absolutely everything. For a start, it gives a huge dignity, does it not, to the very notion of the person. If personality is just something which has happened to emerge somewhere down the evolutionary line and that, who knows, will probably disappear again sooner or later, then persons are simply like the waves of the ocean in temporary configurations with a certain ephemeral and sometimes curious characteristic, but with no cosmic significance. As theologian John Frame puts it, we either live in a universe in which everything that is personal reduces to the impersonal, or a universe in which everything that is impersonal reduces to the personal. And if this universe in which you and I live is most fundamentally matter and time and chance, then it becomes very hard to argue that one combination of these three, matter and time and chance, is necessarily and of itself better or more valuable than any other combination. For example, that life is intrinsically better than death, or that kindness is better than selfishness, in any way that gets deeper than a feeling or an unjustifiable decision. In passing, but also of huge significance, the personality of God also breaks apart the fact-value dichotomy that besets modern ethics and that has driven the sciences and the arts ever further apart in the modern period. Thus far in the session, we've been tracing out some of the implications of the biblical truth that God is personal, But of course, the Bible says much more about God than simply that he's personal. And so now I'd like us to turn our attention to two further aspects of God's character that are spoken about in Scripture. The first is that God is absolute. He's an absolute personality. And the second is that God is Trinity. So let's look at each of those now in turn. The God of the Bible is, of course, not the only God of the ancient or modern world who is personal. The Greeks and the Romans had as many personal gods as you could shake a stick at, and indeed, as Paul found out at the Areopagus in Acts 17, even more that you couldn't shake a stick at. Now, what is unique about the biblical God is not simply that he's personal, but that he's personal and absolute. Where absolute means that he doesn't rely on anything outside himself for his existence, and that he's fundamental, not able to be broken down into more basic parts. And this compound of absolute personality is unique, as far as I know, to the biblical God. And it's one of the fundamental figures that structures a biblical understanding of reality. Because many religions of the East, for example, know of absolute deities, principles, life forces, world souls. And indeed Aristotle has his absolute prime or unmoved mover, but these deities are not personal. And therefore it's the combination of absoluteness and personality that makes the biblical God unique, and that is also such wonderfully good news for our world. Because the absolute gives us the universal, it gives us law, justice, predictability, stability, order in the universe. And the personal gives us dignity, humanitarianism, creativity, relationship, meaning, love, compassion, freedom. And we often make the apologetic point, and we're quite right to do so, that the absolute is the basis for the study of the sciences, that the biblical God grounds a study of the sciences. But how often do we acknowledge that God's personality is equally the basis for the study of the arts and the humanities? The fact that the Bible's account of the world furnishes an unrivaled basis for the study of the sciences is already wonderful. But that it simultaneously, and without contradiction or tension, gives us an unrivaled justification for the study of the arts, well, that is doubly affirmative of human striving and culture in a way that is very, very hard to get to outside the biblical framework. And if you reflect on it, most views of the world, most academic disciplines, and indeed most people, overemphasize either the universal or the personal, and therefore unbalance reality in one way or another. But for the Bible, wonderfully, there's no zero-sum game between the personal and the absolute, between order and creativity, between law and personality. Because neither God's absoluteness nor his personality is more ultimate than the other one. And neither of them acts as a foundation for the other. They are equally radical, equally basic, and utterly inseparable. Now, this is really quite exciting. This is a move that we see again and again as we try and bring the Bible to bear on our contemporary culture. Because the Bible, time and time again, will refuse a dichotomy that's offered to us by our culture, a choice where it must be this or it must be that. And typically, it must be politically left or it must be politically right. And it's a move that in the past I've called diagonalization, because what the Bible does is it cuts across this dichotomy in a way that shows both of the choices to be a reductive heresy of a more complex biblical truth. as well as being absolute and personal, the biblical God is also a Trinity. And we might quite rightly ask, so what? What difference does that make? Well, for one thing, it means that just as personality itself is basic in our universe and not an emergent property, so also relationship is part of the fabric of reality right from the beginning. It's not something that enters the story of the universe later on. God is not, first of all, a lone person who then enters into relationship with other persons. God's being is relational all the way back, and again, all the way down. And this presents a rich, life-affirming alternative to two possible stumbling blocks that societies have fallen into. The first is the atomization of the individual that's often the default position of modern Western societies today. And then there's also the stifling collective identity in which the individual is lost, which is the tendency of some non-Western societies. But again, we need to go even further than this. We've not said enough yet to capture the biblical account of the nature of God, because these three persons of the Trinity don't enjoy some sort of vanilla-flavoured, generic relationship. In fact, if we cast our eyes over the verses in the Bible that refer to God's activity before creation, one word keeps returning again and again and again. And that word is love. Agape. And this means that we live in a universe, you and I, in which agapic love is fundamental and primary. It's coded into the operating system of reality. And if we turn away from the Bible for a moment and study views of the world where love is not primary, we often find that it's power that takes that place of ultimacy in the place of love. In fact, much modern secular politics and social theory seeks to construct power and conflict as that which is most fundamental to social relationships. And in doing this, it's got a fundamental commitment to violence, whether it realises it or not. Theologian John Milbank puts it this way. He says, "There emerges to view a hidden thread of continuity between antique reason and modern secular reason. And this thread of continuity is the theme of original violence." But instead of an original violence and an original conflict, Christian Trinitarian theism has an original charity, an original agape, and therefore an original peace. Now, we could spend a whole talk teasing out the implications of that single observation. Its huge implications for politics, for the economy, for social policy, for law, for education, for the workplace, for families, and for international relations. Would that we could end this talk here and simply talk about God's triune being, God creating a wonderful world and human beings in his own image. But as we all painfully know, a grasp of creation alone is not enough to understand the world that God has created, to understand our world. And in fact, overemphasizing the truth of God's nature and his loving creation at the expense of other moments of the biblical narrative actually leads to a very lopsided and dangerously distorted picture of humanity and the world. It's true, of course, that sin makes no sense without creation. But the other way around, creation makes no sense of our world without sin. The Bible, interestingly, tells us very little of what life was like for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, because after the opening 2 chapters of Genesis, we quickly arrive at the second epic moment in the Bible's story after creation, when sin enters the world in Genesis 3. And again, the biblical account of this monumental epochal event is brief, isn't it? It's unadorned. It's an account with phrase after phrase that etch themselves on our minds and on our collective unconscious in cultures that have been influenced by the Bible. The serpent was crafty. Did God really say? And then, you will not surely die. She took of its fruit and ate, and he ate. What is this you have done? And then the Lord God banished them from the Garden of Eden. Now those are the skeletal events as related in Genesis 3. But our question today is, how can these events help us to engage with the cultural and social and intellectual debates of our age? How do we read our culture through these key biblical moments? What I want to try and show in this part of the session today really boils down to one deceptively simple thought, and pardon me for its brutally simple articulation. Creation and the fall are different. There you go. Ask for your money back if you like. That's what we're going to think about for a few minutes. Creation and the fall are different. It's a straightforward thought, isn't it? But its implications for our culture and for our contemporary world are, I think, huge. Taken together, Genesis 1 to 3 provide the Bible with an anthropology and indeed a cosmology of two distinct lenses. Now, we'll see in time when we do redemption in the second session that there are more than two, but I just want to focus on these two for now. Creation and fall. And this is distinct among the ways of looking at the world today. Most contemporary secular ways of looking at reality have what we might call a single lens anthropology. Now, what I mean by that is that this single-lensed anthropology looks at the present condition of human beings as being qualitatively in continuity with how things have always been. There haven't been any qualitative transformations of the human condition, and also in continuity with how things will always be. There's never been anything qualitatively different to the current state of affairs. Things have changed over time, but not in any dramatic way that philosophers will call an event. And therefore, and this is the key, there are no grounds on which to assert that the way human beings are now is not the way that they ought to be. And if this single-lensed anthropology is the case, the only way that you can challenge the status quo is by force, either force of words or force of arms. But the paradigm in both of these cases is confrontation and competition. A multi-lensed biblical anthropology, by contrast, is very different. It insists that human existence today, after Genesis 3, is neither original, nor is it the standard of how things should always be. That we were created to be something better than what we now are. It asserts that our present state doesn't ultimately define us, and our present state does not ultimately confine us either. And these two lenses of creation and fall, and the overall sweep of the biblical story in general, should, I think, caution Christians against two equally unbiblical errors. The first is utopianism, to think that we human beings have it within us to create heaven on earth. And the danger of this position, if we believe it, is that it becomes easier to justify any means whatsoever to achieve this supremely desirable end of creating heaven on earth. It's the temptation of violent revolutions that consider any finite bloodshed excusable in the course of bringing about the eternal, perfect society. And it is one great political temptation of our age. But there's an equal and opposite temptation, and that's the temptation of the pessimist, who believes that everyone is bad and corrupt in every way, at all times, that all politicians are always crooks, or that there's no point in trying to make the world a better place because all such attempts eventually fail anyway. And this is the other great political temptation of our age. One problem with this single-lensed anthropology is it tends to either explain away good or evil as an illusion. So to take an example, the utopian tries to explain away evil in the following way. Murder is only a product of social inequality, for example. Or adultery is simply the inevitable outcome of a biological sexual frustration. Or paedophilia is only one expression of a biological urge that happens to be taboo at our particular point in history and in our particular country. Alternatively, the pessimist will try to explain away the good. So generosity, for example, is merely disguised self-interest. Philanthropy is only motivated by a desire to feel good about ourselves. Altruism is a not so subtle and often misfiring attempt to protect our own genetic heritage. And it's probably also worth pointing out that this optimist-pessimist split doesn't describe a left-right political orientation. Both the left and the right are liable to fall to both of these temptations at different points. And again, the biblical view doesn't merely offer some sort of tepid cardigan and slippers wearing middle ground between this utopianism and pessimism. In fact, the biblical account is more grimly pessimistic than the pessimist, while at the same time being more wildly utopian than the utopian. And so breathtaking acts of kindness and self-sacrifice should rightly delight the Christian, and stomach-churning deeds of barbarity should revolt her. But neither of them should come as a surprise. And neither of them is a threat to her multi-lensed biblical anthropology. So far we've talked about the two lenses of creation and fall, but it's not enough simply to acknowledge the Bible's multi-lensed anthropology. We've got to understand the relationship between the two lenses a little bit better, because they're not equal and opposite as if we were looking through the two lenses of a pair of binoculars. They are in fact sequential, like the lenses of a telescope, if you like. First of all, there's a temporal difference between them. Creation and the fall are not simultaneous. In the biblical account, the "it was very good" of Genesis 1 precedes the "cursed is the ground" of Genesis 3. And secondly, God and the serpent are not two co-original, equal, opposite deities, but the serpent is one of God's creatures, bound by God's curse. And similarly, there's an asymmetry of blessing and cursing for Adam and Eve. God did not say, "Let us make sinners," but "Let us make man in our own image." And although God curses the serpent, he doesn't use the word curse in relation to Eve at all. And he doesn't curse Adam directly, but the ground, which will now produce thistles and thorns for Adam. So both good and evil are of course present after Genesis 3, but they're present differently. They're present, we might say, asymmetrically, because evil is not originary and it will not last forever. In fact, the biblical account is one of the most extreme examples in human culture of a desire to separate the origin of evil from the origin of good. And I want to think through together with you now about four glorious implications of this biblical figure of the asymmetry of good and evil. The first implication for you and for me and for every human being is that our sin does not and cannot ultimately define us. It can have bitter consequences. It can cost us our reputation, our goods and our lives. And unrepented of, it can send us to hell. But it can never be the whole of who we are. And this, wonderfully, is a hopeful truth for a hurting world, isn't it? It's a balm for the broken. It's a light for those in darkness. And it's a light and a balm of which single-lensed anthropologies can know nothing. Secondly, the asymmetry of good and evil means that a biblical attitude to this world can neither be one of simple affirmation nor of straightforward condemnation. Wherever Christians look in the cultural and intellectual world today, we're going to find rebellion against God and evil, including in our own lives and in the church, aren't we? No movement, no artifact, no ideology, no text, no performance, no academic discipline is free from the violence, selfishness, and rebellion of sin, however Christian they may appear on the surface. But also, and equally importantly, nothing in all of culture is so full of these things that it can completely erase the goodness of the original creation. And this is one of the reasons why a Christian approach to cultural criticism ought to be a particularly open and sophisticated form of cultural engagement. Because for the Christian, nothing in creation is utterly evil, and nothing in creation is exhaustively good. But by contrast, if this world is all there is, and if you want to have a functioning ethics and a functioning politics, then you must find the ultimate good and the ultimate evil in this world. Perhaps, for example, in the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, or in the free market and regulation, or in reason and superstition. Finding our ultimate references for good and for evil in this world, whatever those references are, wherever they fall on the political spectrum, is the royal road to a dogmatic, absolutist attitude to culture. But it is not an attitude that the Christian ought to share. As Tim Keller very helpfully puts it, Christians have a particularly rich and sophisticated platform for cultural analysis, and a particular openness to any cultural manifestation within the world. The third consequence of the asymmetry of good and evil is that violence, this is great news, isn't it? Violence is not the ultimate truth of the human condition. And there is a peace that is deeper than any violence. Single-lensed anthropologies again find themselves in the difficult position of having to read normative ethical and political principles off the current state of the world. And this makes it hard to provide any radical critique of the status quo, especially if that status quo appeals to the way things are in establishing its ethical and political positions, as almost all ethics do. So this is why we see appeals to unrealistic utopias or to, frankly, dishonest dystopias. But the asymmetrical biblical account, by contrast, opens the way for a politics and a view of society that aren't trapped in the present, that can look beyond the way things are now to find a model and norms for society. And a biblical attitude to this world can therefore neither be one of simple affirmation nor of straightforward denial. Yes, there's certainly futility in this world. And yes, there are undoubtedly meaning and goodness. But they're not equal and opposite realities. Goodness precedes, exceeds, and, thank goodness, succeeds sin. Fourthly, the asymmetry of good and evil also informs a Christian attitude to cultural production. In Art and the Bible, the author Francis Schaeffer elaborates an account of Christian art that's valid for all forms of cultural production, from literature and television to memes and tweets to buildings and cities. And he argues that Christian art is at its best when it takes account both of what he calls the major theme and the minor theme of the Christian life. The major theme is that of meaning and fullness, flourishing, shalom. And the minor theme is that of sin and decay. And notice the asymmetry built into Schaeffer's terminology here. The minor theme is minor because, as we've already seen, sin is in asymmetrical relationship to the goodness of the major theme. It's derivative, it's contingent, as opposed to the original and ultimate nature of God's good creation. And Schaeffer argues that it's important for Christian artists and producers of culture in the widest sense to take account of both of these themes, but not as if they were symmetrical. An example of art that erases the minor theme altogether might be the painting of Thomas Kinkade. But on the other hand, if art only dwells on the minor theme, never sounding a note of hope, then it similarly falls short of Schaeffer's understanding of a full biblical worldview. It's like the polo neck wearing student who would say, "Oh, I detest Thomas Kinkade. I only ever read Dostoevsky, and I watch The Handmaid's Tale on repeat so as to make sure that I avoid Christian kitsch." Well, that's just the mirror image of Kinkade itself. Both of those are unhelpful heresies. So then, Christian art participates in this asymmetrical reality of the Bible just as much as do Christian ethics or Christian politics. Well, today we've seen just some of the ways in which the concepts and underlying patterns and rhythms of Genesis 1 to 3 can give us perhaps fresh eyes to see some of the most important personal and cultural and intellectual issues of our own time differently, and to contribute to those debates with fresh ideas that haven't simply been recycled from the ambient culture. So what we need to do then is let the Bible, so to speak, set its own table. Let the Bible show us the figures, the patterns and rhythms of understanding reality that it has, and bring these to bear on issues of contemporary moment. And that's what we've been trying to do in this session. We've looked at three figures: absolute personality theism, the asymmetry of good and evil, and agapic Trinitarianism. And a flip side of trying to focus on these biblical figures is to cultivate a healthy suspicion of the terms of the debate and the concepts that often prevail in secular discourse around us, because it's often those very terms of debate, it's often those very concepts that prove a sticking point from a biblical perspective. And it's as we do this, as we focus on the biblical figures and try and use them to work for the flourishing of the society around us, that we'll find ourselves not only explaining the Bible to our culture, necessary though that is, but we'll also be explaining our culture through the Bible.